Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel. Prelude, Doc. Richard Cale was reading a book on the ancients. All his years he had studied the occult, and never had he read about anything so horrifying. As he continued reading, he read about 4 ancients. The first was Chiturga, who appeared to have been a creature that focused on strength and force. Even the description the book had was hideous, with monstrous mouths on its claws and everywhere. The next one was Zelatoth, who Richard thought was linked to the problems his wife was having. Zelatoth's description often included a maddening eye that stared at you. The third one mentioned was Ulioth. Many of the texts agreed he was a mind with what looked like tentacles. The texts even said that his mind powers bordered into very dark magic. Also, those 3 ancients had been in a cyclical battle for eons until they were apparently imprisoned. They had been imprisoned long ago by a being named Mantarok, another ancient who disappeared long ago. He then closed the book, only to reopen it to the cryptic first page. That was what prompted him to get the book in the first place. He reread the words again, this time aloud. Richard and Yvette Cale, when you read this, it is important you call Dr. Edward Roivas. He also noticed the odd border around the page. It took him a while to realize it was the phone number, but now he knew what he had to do. Richard picked up the phone and dialed the number. He hoped he hadn't acted too late, but something told him that time was running out. Soon he heard a voice on the other end. "This is Dr. Roivas." He smiled when he realized he got through. "Dr. Roivas, my name is Richard Cale." He was surprised when Dr. Roivas just said, "I've been waiting for your call. I take it you and your wife have some unique problems." Richard was startled by the statement, but answered nonetheless. "Yes, Dr. Roivas. My wife and I both have problems. My wife says she sees things, but I know she's not crazy. Myself, I don't know how else to explain it, but it feels like I'm in one place, but all of a sudden something changes. It's like a blink of some sorts." He was stunned when Dr. Roivas just said, "I see. It sounds like something I need to see for myself. You will have to come to my home in Rhode Island." Richard was alarmed now. He and Yvette lived in England. It would take time to get ready to come out. He wondered why it wasn't something Dr. Roivas could come to England for, and he needed to know why. Dr. Roivas listened as Richard Cale said, "Wouldn't it be easier if you came to England? We have plenty of room here. I could even book your flight." Dr. Roivas knew Mr. Cale wouldn't understand now. but he would later. He knew that for a fact. He then calmly said, "I can't leave the place for a few weeks. There is something going on here in Rhode Island that I must attend to. It is better that you come to America. In fact, 2 weeks from now is best. I hope that isn't an inconvenience." He was glad to hear that Richard Gale finally agreed. "All right, Dr. Roivas. My wife and I will be there in 2 weeks. I look forward to hearing what you think of our problems, and how your research into the ancients help us understand." Dr. Roivas nodded and said, "It will, whatever it is, be solved in 2 weeks. Until then, have a safe journey." With that, the phone call ended, and he hung up the phone. He looked over at the clock on the table in the foyer. He had not slept that night due to his research into the ancients. When he had heard the phone ring, he had left the secret study and closed the secret door. It was now 6 a.m. By now, his granddaughter Alexandra was sleeping in her dorm room in Seattle. He knew what was coming. He had known for a long time. He had been told what was going to happen decades earlier. That was what prompted him to write the book and sell it. He knew it would find its way to the library of the Cales, and they would call. Now he had made sure that Alexandra would have help in the task that was in front of her. He went back to the library and decided to read over his book again. He looked at the clock again as he went in and saw the time. 6:30 a.m. He had been thinking about everything for a half hour. Not much time was left. He went to his chair and sat down and began to read. Alexandra Roivas looked around the strange room. She remembered falling asleep in her dorm room, but now she was in an odd room. It looked like it belonged at her home in Rhode Island, but the door to the room looked different, like an old asylum door. That was only part of the oddness. She was holding a Winchester shotgun, a weapon she never held before in her life. However, she did know how to use it, especially when the zombies started to appear. She didn't know how they showed up, but she knew she was in danger. She aimed at each one and unloaded one round into each one's head. The results were instant as the heads flew off, but for each one she got rid of, 2 took its place. She had only one course of action. She ran for the door. As she neared it, she heard a loud male voice shout, "May the rats eat your eyes! The darkness comes!" This scared her. What did it mean? What was this darkness? Soon she heard something behind her. She turned around and almost froze in shock. The image of a familiar person was in front of her. It looked like a ghost, but she was sure it wasn't. The figure just looked at her and said, "Remember me, Alex." It was then she heard the ringing. She shook her head and closed her eyes, and then she opened them, only to see she was laying on her bed in her dorm room. She looked at the clock and saw the time. 3:33 a.m. Then she recognized the ringing. It was her phone. Who would be calling her at this hour? She held her breath, dreading what was going to be on the phone. She was still groggy as she answered the phone. Hello? The voice on the other line sounded gruff, but calm. Miss Alexandra Roivas. She started to wake more at that. Yes, who's this? She was not in too much shock as the man answered. This is Inspector Legrasse. I'm sorry to disturb you. There's been an accident with your grandfather. That was all she needed to hear. She took a moment to recover from the news and said, I'll be on the next flight out. She hung up the phone and started to arrange the flight back to Rhode Island. Inspector Legrasse waited in the library for Alexandra Roivas to arrive. When she finally arrived, he greeted her and showed her to the scene. It was a gruesome scene, but he knew what he had to do. The other officers had done what they had to do and had returned to their cars. It would be some time until the scene was cleaned up, but he understood why. He looked at the scene and asked the question of Alexandra Roivas. Is that your grandfather? She nodded as she recovered from the sight as she said, Yes, he's wearing the family ring. But why couldn't you use dental records? That would have told you who it was. He shook his head and said, We couldn't do that because there was no head. This is crazy. No forced entry. The door's locked. It doesn't make sense at all. I'm not sure where the answers are. It was partially true, but she didn't need to know everything. She looked at him and said, Well, you better find answers, because I'm not leaving Rhode Island until I get them. He watched as she headed out. He knew the police would provide a place for her to stay until the scene was cleaned up. But he wasn't worried. When she was gone, he walked to two officers and said, Keep an eye on her and the house. I need to know if anyone arrives to investigate. She might be able to find out what happened. He then headed, not to the front door, but the basement door, as he also changed forms. Instead of looking like a police detective, he now looked like the Roman centurion. He headed down the steps and through all the protective measures back down to Enga. As he moved down, he said, Soon it will be time.